Today I'm going to be working on this beautiful image, and what a portrait of this beautiful bird. The light on it, and obviously we have those dark feathers with hints of color, which almost want me. They make me want to use color, but what I want to do is use ink for the drawing. So I'm going to use ink pens, and I'm going to be using these or my microns to draw the bird and some features on the landscape. But I'm going to use more of the color on the landscape, making it more sort of a watercolor landscape to highlight the black and white ink lines of my bird. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. For that reason, I'm going to use a little bit of tape to create, because I am working on my bird sketchbook today, the watercolor sketchbook. So I'm going to use some tape for a nice little frame to keep the consistency. And my invitation to you today is experimenting with your favorite medium or revisiting a different medium, whether it's graphite, charcoal, ink pens. Also considering, are you working on your sketchbook? Or which type of paper is going to be offering maybe something new in terms of technique, in terms of drawing method, maybe in terms of size. So you notice I'm working a little bit of a smaller format today. That's going to allow me to work tons more detail with the saturation of ink lines. So I could take my time and try to be as patient as possible throughout this entire session. And there we go. So this gel tape, it's amazing. Just keeping that small little frame all around. And there we have it. And I always recommend, if you have, if you need okay, so what do I do? Where do I start? How do I go about this? To always pick out a separate sheet. I could use the other side of my sketchbook, but I'm going to use this more for color swatches. So I could actually pick a random or just a piece of scrap paper and do a regular warm-up sketch, so you can play with thumbnails and composition and how you may rearrange some of those features. But I'm going to go right in, and I'm going to use a few graphite pencil lines, my mechanical pencil here, to get right into what I'm going to do for the full size of my bird here. So in terms of composition, I'm going to also keep it to the right as it is here. And I'm going to try to bring in the colors of this landscape to what I envision is then showcase. It's going to be that balance between line and color, but the heavy lines, very dark lines that I'm going to try to create on the bird are going to somehow be showcased, I guess, by that frame of color. So this drawing may be a little too small now that I see it, but again, it's that big choice in the beginning. If I go bigger than this, it's going to be a 3, 4, 5 hour drawing with the plan that I have for the amount of lines. So I think this will work out really well. And I won't feel like I need to rush. So I'm going to do a little bit of straight line study now that I have my big, simple shape. Clean up just a little bit. Maybe had a little too much coffee this morning. So a little jitter here in the line. And I want to just really begin to get familiar with the inner shapes, because there's something so beautiful about working with a dark subject with that hint of light. Is how do we see the shapes within the shapes, the forms? Because remember, from shapes, simple shapes here, how we develop the light is going to give us those beautiful muscle shapes, those muscle forms, and the overlap and the buildup of the chest, wings, and feathers. So really becoming familiar with your subject, step one. Somehow beginning to use a little more negative space. What does that mean? Areas where I can actually see shapes with no name. So I don't see, and I don't want to use the words while I'm drawing, the wings or feet. It's actual triangular or more geometric shapes that I kind of try to identify. And it's really truly focused on the angles of the line. Now I want to see how this foreground is going to play out. So I'm going to thin it out just a little bit. And I want that nice, rich, kind of red clay color with the feet. So it's perching right at the tip there. So this may have to resize, because I see this element here, the negative space between the legs, as something that is going to help me create nice little breaks in the visual of the black. So in terms of drawing, I'm not going for something that's more gestural. I will kind of deviate. I will go towards something that I want to bring up more and more, which is drawing should not be photography. Photography is photography, and that's why we already have a nice photograph of this. So for drawing, when you're drawing from a photography, from a photo, what can you add to it? In the same way I say that, what do you need to take away from it to enhance and make use of what drawing or watercolor can give you to create a nice new image, using maybe some of your own ideas. And this one, somehow if you think back to mythology or literature, things that can maybe feed into, or why not, some poetry, I'm sure, that can actually play in. And I'm not saying literal text, but the vision or the inspiration. Let's make this a little simple for now, just to get the size as we begin to see it coming together. And yes, I am taking a little longer, a little more time because I really want to capture these muscle shapes. And I'm also beginning to map out the light and shadows. There's lots of interesting value shifts that are going to create that muscle tone. It's not so much the line, but it's going to be the light and the darks that are going to bring that out. So I begin to see, okay, in terms of size, in terms of composition, it is a little larger. There's not so much sky above the head. So it's going to be a little more close up in terms of our portrait here. And there's also a little bit of foreshortening to this profile. So this beak is not exactly profile. It's coming a little towards us. So I want to think about that three-dimensionality and how it's not exactly to the left, but more, let's call it, if this were east And this is south, it's southeast, or a touch south of east, coming towards us. Now I don't want to move too much into the detail area here because I'm going to rework that and I'm going to make all of those ink lines. But I want some of these pencil lines to make it a lot easier for me when I get to that point. So as guidelines, that's literally what they are. Lines that will make it, that will guide me through my ink, permanent ink marks, helping me make easier decisions, more confident decisions when the time comes. And you could begin to see if we're in the ballpark. I'm going to have to do a lot of zooming in later on for some of these shifting values. And the quality of line, whether it's scumbling or parallel hatches, what I choose to use, some of this gestural line to create that feathery look. I should kind of begin to consider that as I finish up these lines here. And now let's add just a few more to the background. And I haven't decided yet whether some ink lines should be part of the background, so ink and watercolor, or just pencil line and watercolor. But what I do is really, at this point, squint. Because again, I don't want to see mountains. I don't want to see trees or whatever's there. I want to see shapes of variations of what seems like horizon lines and just beautiful shifting shapes of color, lights and shadows, greens and yellows and reds and browns. And again, it's not the focus. We have some clouds, and these gray clouds will play perfectly, beautifully into taking us away from the white of the page, also enhancing even more, creating a little more contrast because it's just white enough, gray enough to make this black stand out even more. So what would be the first step here? Should I do watercolor? Since we use the formula of biggest, simplest, that would be the biggest. Can I work around my ink lines? So in terms of strategy, I'm going to go right into watercolor first. And it also will allow it to begin to dry just enough. So I'm going to be using, today I'm going to be using this set of watercolors, my travel. And I'm going to be using this, my squirrel quill, and it's a number 0. It's the smallest one I have because I am anticipating some small shapes. And I'm just going to start with some of these grays, beginning with a little bit of blue. And I'm going to use temperature-wise, there's cool. And then we have the warm colors of the stones. So I'm going to touch just a tiny bit of cobalt blue with a tiny bit of ultramarine in it. And some of these I could just, there is no gradient to it. I'm just going to almost color them in where I had those pencil lines. And you should think about, well, can I play with this technique? Can I do something that would enhance even more? So let's push a little bit of wet on wet, just a bit towards the top, and bring some of that even lighter with the touch of gray. So how did I do that gray? I had these blues, And I used a little bit of it. If you have burnt umber, that's great, but I'm using, it's a sepia. And it gives this really cool gray that I'm going to use for some of the base of these shadows. If you don't have that, a Payne's gray or ivory black with the blue should do the trick. And I'm going to try to do a little more wet on wet here. And I do want to preserve just a little bit of some of these whites. And then from the bottom, bring in a little bit of extra shadow. I shouldn't worry too much about this. My landscape can very easily be just abstract. Shapes of color. What you do want is that horizontal, horizon line type feel to them. Now here at the bottom you may do something different as well, where you see breaks and some of the mountain features. So simply how you begin to draw with watercolor is what I'm doing. I do think just a bit in terms of painting when I bring in some of that wet on wet technique and the timing of just dropping in. But overall, I really wanted to feel like drawing. Really bring out a little more of that gray. Some of these rainy, it looks rainy like shadows under the cloud. And again, simply drawing them in. And work around my bird, but there would not be much of an issue with these colors to actually go right in and right through. It actually could bring out some of that nice blue. Making sure it's fully dry before I begin to draw my ink lines. And if you need to break this down into layers, well, then you just want to make sure you time it right. You dry it, let it dry. While I let this area dry, I'm going to work the bottom. And that I'm going to bring in, I have this Venetian red. It's almost a combination of yellow ochre and a warm red. But this should be, I'm guessing, I'm mixing a little bit of yellow into it. But it should almost be automatic. There it is. It's just in the spectrum of orange, a little more towards the brown. So how do you do that? Look for your orange, neutralize it with maybe a little bit of blue if you don't have those colors. Notice again, I'm going right into some of the area where the feet will be, going in and around, but because I'm going to be working with those ink lines, I don't worry much unless I need to preserve some of that white. But even for this drawing, I could always come back with a little bit of white paint or white ink pen or white gouache and add some of those touches right after the fact as finishing touches. So I'm breaking some of these, and again, I want to be very careful here because there's also a little bit of blur happening as we reach further into the distance. So there's less sharpness in some of these lines. I don't want these to bleed in or mix into my sky, so I'm being just a little careful towards the edges. And most of this is very, very unsaturated, lightly saturated, wet on dry. I bring in a little extra water to hopefully create that sensation of out of focus. I'm going to mix in Viridian Green. I'm going to work this area here, which is, I'm going to touch it with a little bit of Cool Red, and we get this automatic, almost a little more green. I still want it to be in the, I'm going to try to neutralize that color, and I'm going to test it first. But I do want it to be just a little bit darker, so I'm going to shade it. I'm going to use a little bit of Ivory Black. Just a little. And I'm going to create just a pattern. Squiggly lines almost. And again, I don't want this to get too dark, competing with, not that it would, with the ink lines that are coming later. And just create a nice little pattern that kind of continues right into here. Hopefully I still see my lines when I need them later. And I could do just a tiny variation into a warm green. So this is a little bit of olive green coming in. Oops, a little more shade. And I'm doing this while I squint, because that's one of the keys is, how do you see what you need to see? Right now, it should all be a blur. So literally squinting as hard as you can right through your eyelashes to just see mostly light shape and the lightness or darkness of that shape. Obviously, I'm also thinking about the temperature and the color. And the color, we'll call it the family, whether it's a little more in the greens or a little more in the oranges, like we did here, and pushing that to more of a neutral. In landscapes, that's what we do a lot. We use a lot of neutral earth tones, those earth colors, and just play with it. Remember, this is all almost coming together as a bit of an abstract combination of shapes and values. I just added a little bit of ultramarine there. There's a tiny bit of, there's specks of that earth tone, brown orange we mixed here, that Venetian red like. There's little pops of it with a little extra light. I want to highlight, there's light coming in the back in the distance. So I want to show that, and for that I'm going to go to my yellow ochre. Bring in a little bit of yellow ochre. Start with mostly yellow ochre here. Touch it just a bit with, and I actually did that red stripe back there. But I'm going to just bring that in as a first layer, as a wash, flat wash of layer. That gets a little bit yellower, so I'm going to bring in a little more light. And this one's too cool. So maybe what I want to do here is lift some of it. And bring in just a little extra water again. And there's so many beautiful layers happening that get smaller and thinner into the distance and even further back. But again, my focus is not the landscape, but you could have a blast working this out. Creating a little bit of sharpness here, and I need that to create that sensation of, okay, this is right here at the front. So with a little extra consistency, thicker paint, making sure it's fully dry, I'm going to draw some sharper edge strokes right here in the front. And what I want is not for this to get too colorful. So the neutrality of your colors should be planned. Planning always to touch it and push it or pull it into the middle of the spectrum. Some of these blues, that neutrality of the gray, I think it really is important, especially when we bring in those dark black ink lines later on. So I'm mixing now ultramarine blue with a little bit of black, and that's going to give us sort of that Payne's gray look. And I'm going to touch just a few while this is still wet. Create sort of that distant horizon line there. And there's some variation to the shape there with some, and it comes all the way across to the other side where we have some breaks right in this beautiful we southwest, midwest top rock formations. I think I need one last one here. I'm going to push this yellow, which is a little too cool, towards a little more orange, a little warmer. And then my warm green, just looking for a little bit of a neutral color of green coming down the side of this hill here. Pop some of that color in other areas. And this, I mean, this could just keep going on and on and on, but we're going to have to let it dry. The areas where I need to rework it, anything near and close to my bird is what I need. I don't want to have to kind of come close and retouch that later. So the more finished it is in and around the bird, especially down here, the better. But anything else, we can always come back. We can always come back in a little while and take a second look at how some of these can be enhanced, reshaped. But simplicity. Simplicity is always a good formula. So I'm going to bring out my dryer, and I'm going to help it just a little bit. Perfect. So as I'm drying it, I got a good chance to kind of step back and look at it for a second, and I realize this needs to be just a touch darker. So I'm going to go right in, finish it up now. And it's this area here, right behind our foreground, that needs to bring out a little bit of that edge. And if you notice, it does get really dark really quick. So I need to make that blurrier. From sharp to blurry in sort of a quick manner here. not a glaze. And as it comes near our bird, it turns a little greener. That's what I see. And there's some little specks of that red clay. So just to enhance that atmospheric perspective, whatever's sharper means it's closer. Whatever's blurrier, it means it's more at a distance. Also, whatever's darker is closer. Whatever's lighter is further. The more air between you and it, the more of that color of the air that should be in it. And that's how I bring in the blurriness. I just touch the edge of it with a little clean water and just draw in and around. So yeah, that did it. That does create a little more space. We'll rework a few things, but again, not to make that the priority. You do want a good landscape back there. Beautiful. So we want to make sure this is, it's not just bone dry, it's hot. So that's good. And no moisture anywhere. I'm going to keep these watercolors over here to the side. And we're going to start our ink lines. So my recommendation always is we start with biggest and simplest. I'm going to start with the 0.5. I don't think we need a 0.8. And sometimes a 0.5 for a format like this, which is so small, may be too much. So I'm going to test a few lines and may go way smaller with the pen. So where would I start? Well, generally, we would want to start a contour. But as I'm squinting, well, I need to zoom in just a little bit now to my bird here. It's a safe place to start right here where I see some of the darker. And I want to test just a few lines here. So you want to be careful with some of this edge because it's pretty final. I mean, you could always go outside of it. But as we begin to draw these lines, I'm going to begin to think about what kind of lines and bringing that always back to the forefront. What's important here? The gauge, the thickness of the line, the value that that line's going to make. So the saturation of the number of lines that you're putting in a specific area, but the direction and the shape of that line. So we have a lot of subtle SC shapes here. And there's one way I can always, I think it makes sense when I say it. You almost want to feel like you're literally putting the pen, the tip of the pen, right onto the bird. And you would just follow that concave, convex. And I usually show you here if it was my hand. I would be following the motion as it rounds, as it follows. So the shape and the direction of that line and the small little curvature of it is what really creates pretty much what we're looking for. That texture, the look. It's beyond line, it's beyond value, knowing that that's important. Notice I'm going upwards now just to create that darkness, the saturation. I'm not just filling it in. And yeah, this 0.5 is going to work for some of these bigger areas where I don't want to just fill it in. I want to really see what's going on from the bone to the muscle to the feather. But I don't want to think. I don't even want to use those words. Remember, it comes out as you think. But what you see in front of you is what you want to capture. What do you see in front of you? You want to see shapes. Try to mimic, capture those shapes through the lines you draw with the correct value. And the moment you start thinking feather, switch back. Non-verbal. What you're doing here is purely trying to see. And these shapes can get very complex. That's the whole point. The more complex they get, the more you have to figure out how to simplify them. To try to stay as simple as possible. And now some of these edges may be getting a little too thin for me to be using this pen. So also pacing yourself, and that means be ready to switch pens when you need to. Don't keep going until it's too late. And then follow a strategy. So I started here to test it, but now I could keep going this way. So don't just keep going where you shouldn't be right now. Try to finish up the shape that you saw originally. And when you look at shapes, and in this case we're looking at shapes of dark, light, some grays. Well, you want to recognize the edges of those shapes. That's the trick. So when those edges begin to get really complex, not to lose your place. You want to keep your eyes on the reference as long as possible. We forget, as we begin drawing these complex lines, we stop looking. Generally speaking, we stop looking at the reference and we freeze looking at our page and only our page, which then forces you to make up lines that are not there, shapes that are not there. So finding a way to keep your eyes on your subject so you don't lose your place, so you see the shape, so you see the value, and trust your hand and glancing, just glancing down for 1 or 2 seconds every now and then just to make sure you're in the right spot. And wow, I'm going to switch down to a number 3. And I'm going to work out some of these small little lines and edges down here. And I have a 01 and a 005 ready to go. But if I have a contour that I could just, and I am following some of these pencil lines still, but I'm seeing lots and lots of negative space. And I'm just going by that. And it almost seems like it's all just black. So if you see black, well then you just make it a rich black. So I'm leaving a little space of light in between some of them. Others, you really just want to saturate it. So a combination of crosshatch maybe and what you need to do. And it begins to look really rich. It really starts looking, it has that feather look that I wanted. And I'm going to begin to move into the outer edge of this area and just follow it all the way around. That's going to make kind of the coloring it in aspect of ink lines a little bit easier. Sort of finishing up this drawing. Here we have a very important break. We have that light coming in on this element. And again, it's not using the words, nonverbal, that keeps you focused on what you need to be focused on. If you need to zoom in and make it abstract as possible. Oh, but that's it. It's just a bird's leg. Oops. Right there, you just oversimplified. You want to just recognize, if you're looking for texture, break down the type of line, the type of shapes if you could see them, and try to come up with lines, dots, dashes, patterns. See, I'm going to need my smallest pen. So I will save that, and I'm going to go into this side here too. Just making sure you're not jumping ahead. Be patient. And when you need to get into smaller areas, make sure you have the right gauge for ink lines. If you're working ink lines, you want to have the right thickness, the right gauge of line. So I'm just going to mark them in and keep moving. Come back to the smaller details. And so I'm really zoomed in. I can only see curves. I begin to see these small little SC shapes, and it all looks just black. But get creative. Get creative with how you generate, how you create that sense of black. The pattern of line and the saturation of those lines. Using ink pens, what it does in terms of making it rich, it's not just because you can just paint it in, color it in. Using all of the variations of patterns of lines, consistency with those patterns. So if I'm using parallel hatches, which is what I've been doing for the most part here, following the direction of the feathers, I don't want to, not that you can't or shouldn't, go from scumble to zigzaggy to, if it's what it's called for, if it's what you see, then that's what you do. But one general rule is consistency of line gives you that harmony, overall harmony that you want in your drawings. And it's, again, back to the less is more. So if you could do a lot with less combinations of line, it speaks clearer. It says it better. I have some beautiful watercolor edges, and unfortunately I have to draw over them. Most of the time I would want that to show in my drawing. So you have decisions to make as you go along. I don't know if I've mentioned that, but you know it already. When you begin to think about pace, so we got the direction down, we got the saturation down, we pretty much read the values. When you begin to think about pace, there's different stages. This one here, bigger, larger in terms of surface. I want to finish it faster. Make sure you pace yourself. You're setting up the foundation for things to come. Sometimes it feels like, well, I just gotta, it's all black, so I could just kind of swoosh it in. It really matters. It really matters that you pace yourself all the way from the beginning through every stage, all the way to the final one, the end. Once again, beautiful SC shapes here. right at the edge, and I'm working more from the contour in, if that's how you see it. Still have lots of just black, where I barely see any variation, just some edges of light. So get creative. That's the chance to get creative. We understand the form, we understand the shapes. You don't really have to be an expert at anatomy or bird anatomy, but you get the sense of how the perspective. You want to think about the weight or the lightness of certain parts here, how that would work, and what kind of line would give you that sense, bring that out. I'm beginning to do a little more of a curved pattern right towards the edges, and I do use a little bit of that feathering where it tapers the line so I could layer it, and it will create that overlap of feathers while at the same time giving us that light shadow on a black subject. I'm not sure if I would call this black because there's so many beautiful deep blues and purples. It almost kind of reads almost as purple. Going up with some big lines here. And when in doubt, as always, less lines. You can always come back and add more. But be careful because, again, those first lines that you add, like I'm doing here, I could just stripe this and fill it up. And I know I will come back and add a second and third layer, and I could think of ink line layers. It's also layers of feathers upon feathers. So the ones that are all the way underneath and then the ones on top. Which ones would you work on first? Not that you need, again, not thinking of feathers. You want to see it as a whole in your mind, but focusing on what that shape is dictating. Let's go up to this side. I want to connect through. So I'll draw some guidelines with ink, seeing some of these shapes. Again, squinting. It's going to make it easier to see those edges. And here's what I'm talking about. I could, a big area like this, I could always build it up from biggest lines to a nice layering from bottom to top, top to bottom, however you see that. Now with ink lines, there's a point where it just gets full black. You can't go any further. So just like watercolor, you want to keep that. That phase, that stage, workable. You don't want to hit it unless you know, for example, here, it could just not get any blacker, and that's it. The shape is all black, and it goes through the shadow in the bottom here, also black. But I want to keep it flexible as I build it up. As I begin to see more and more of these layers coming together, I may be able to redirect, have more options without having hit that. Whoops, I'm already too dark. I could have layered it a little lighter and have some light. So I'm also shaping these kind of in a long feather shape. So the curve, it's almost coming together at the tips. So it's long arched lines, kind of tipped, like the shape of the tip of the feather. But they have a nice, beautiful curvature to it as well, that now you begin to see how it reads here and there. It begins to read where there's light, a little more like muscle. Like, okay, we see the roundness of the bottom, and then we're going to see the roundness and the beautiful muscle. On the shoulders, neck, and chest. It is beautiful too to, again, get more familiar with the subject and needing to get more familiar with their anatomy. Really understanding how their wings and shoulders and chest, as they pose, give us a sense of perspective. I mentioned weight, sometimes movement. I also had an idea. Early on, I wanted to maybe work one of these, and it would have been a little riskier, but again, the bigger the risk, bigger the payoff sometimes. Where I could just create washes, and we've been doing these water-soluble watercolor pencils, ink pens, where you could just wash, and then you have already tons of values that you can then reinforce with some ink lines, and maybe not that many. So there's so many options to look for. And here, before I move in, we're going to have to really break this down into bigger shapes first, into smaller and smaller. But I need to see those smallest ones first in order to work it backwards. I don't want some of these bigger lines forcing me or just covering what should have been later lots of smaller little patterns. So how do I do that? Well, again, squinting. You're going to see biggest, darkest, and just follow that and begin to break it down. So I'm going to have to switch to an even smaller pen now. So I was working with the 03. I'm going to use a 01 here. And finish up this area first. So we have this beautiful light, and it's a nice, beautiful highlight coming right here on this shoulder. So I want to make sure I have lines. And as we get smaller with the ink, with the gauge of our ink pen, you almost begin to feel more intimate with those shapes. Obviously, it makes sense. The bigger, the wider. Sometimes you feel a little more disconnected from it. It's just could I say that, less here I guess you're more engaged. Also because the way it works out, the way it leaves a mark. It's smaller, covers less area, and you can actually begin to get more detail. So it's pushing us towards that final stage where it could be finished. Like some of these lines here, I don't want to go much further than that. So it's still at the large stage where I want to be loose and big and general. But at the same time, some of these lines could hit that finished mark. And that's, again, part of your technique, part of your strategy. Visualizing that, knowing when you're done, as one of the most important parts, one of the most important things to know. And I do have a pen that's even smaller than this. I'm going to want to bring it in maybe sooner than I thought for all of the details here in the neck, all of this light. You want it to be smooth in terms of transition. It will get dark really fast, even with the small pens, as these areas get smaller and smaller. I'm going to want to come back into some of these as well, because now that you see these, you begin to see these a lot lighter. So some longer lines, rounder, giving us that chest. And just a little bit of an extra layer. It's amazing how this automatically begins to read as light and texture. And it's understanding that all of the different techniques, no matter what the medium, you can reach that they all are supposed to do the same. Understanding how you use your lines to create all the variations of shapes and value. But then also contrast. How when we make an area darker makes everything look lighter. And now that we have these lighter, what used to be dark doesn't look as dark. So coming back in, having that wiggle room of not overworking it. And we may say, is that a matter of opinion? Because that looks overworked. Well, for this subject, I'm trying to keep it as light as possible. What I mean light, the number of lines, I'm trying to really measure. Keeping in mind that less is more. The length and direction of them. But really, again, ask yourself, when was the last time? How often am I looking at my reference? What is the kind of information? Is it accurate, the information that I'm seeing? Can I simplify it a little more? Beginning to apply a little bit of your gesture, your unique quality of line, so it really becomes your drawing. In a very, very unique way, you're creating sort of these signatures every time you draw a line, showing us how you connected with the subject. And one of those things I love to see from artists is when you can feel how much they loved the subject. Think of Van Gogh and Sunflowers. Think of Monet and Water Lilies. So many samples, so many examples of connecting deeply with the subject. And it shows. It's one of those things where they say in sports and other things, you become it. You become the ball. You become the flower. And how do you do that? You really just give in. It's a mental process. It's a little bit of letting go, of control, of ego, who we are, and connecting with the beautiful subject, letting it take over. And you know when you're there. But it's also just having fun. In the end, that's it. So it looks like I timed it right because we still have most of the, I don't want to say hardest work, but I'm going to say careful work, measured work coming up. So seeing what I see happening here, I have an idea of what I can do up here. And it's going to be a little more, again, obviously the features, the focal point. If any focal point, it would be right here where this light and the glimmer on the eye, the beak, obviously. So those values and the type of line, the overlap, I keep going at this area, but I just see things. I feel like I need to just push a little further. There. Start with, once again, squinting. Remember, some of the areas that pop up immediately are the darkest, but you don't want to just overwork those areas. You want to start, you want to see them first, see the shape. And begin to use more stippling, more dots instead of lines. As I begin to use more careful, more measured variations of value. And I think I'm just going to work a final little area here. But it is definitely time to switch pens. And what I've been saying, connecting with your subject, it's really reaching your fingers out and touching the area that you're drawing. Can you feel what it feels like before you draw a line? So look at that head and imagine your index finger touching it. Feeling the roundness, feeling the slickness or the sharpness or the roughness. Switching over to a 005. And it's going to get much, much finer here. I want to get a little bit of that contour first. So using a little bit of dash dot type line. Not just a controlled, sharp, straight line. I want to break it up a little bit so it doesn't get too heavy at first, although I could see some light already. I'm beginning to use more variations of different lines. Lots of stippling. A lot more dash and dot, as I also want to make sure the direction of my line tapers. Now with ink pens, there's another thing that happens when you start working these lines. It's how vertical, how perpendicular to the page is your pen. Sometimes you have to have it 90 degrees in order to get that absolute perfect. And you hear that little scratch. That's great. To make sure we capture that right gauge of line. I'm going to zoom in all the way where, again, trying to see this as abstract as possible. No names, no words, just shapes and values. What I was saying earlier, where you could go a little too dark too fast and then you have nowhere else to go. When you reach the darkest value, no wiggle room after that. You don't want to get there too fast, because these areas, the smaller they get, the faster they're going to reach that dark value. Notice that beautiful curve. There's so many curves and shapes to this beak here. Almost want to switch to the smallest. I'm going to try to go with the absolute smallest pen I have, which is a 003. And I used to have a 001. Oh yes, this is it. And that's going to bring out that light little gray, hair thin, that still looks like light, as I also manage. You could see the direction and some of the scratches, some of the light. To render the form of the beak without using that word. So it comes down to understanding concave and convex shapes here. How do you create that level of roundness that goes from concave to convex, back to flat to curve, and how much of a curve? Wow, this is a great exercise to really understand that. Everything is round and curve, but the way they flatten out and darken, while having to maintain some of that light here, it's a big test. Doesn't have to be. You could just remember the way you see it. And I'm sure with less lines, it'll still you'll still solve the puzzle. What I'm trying to say is there's not just one way. There's your way and 7 billion other ways, which I cannot wait to see. But really, Think about how closely, how much time we spent looking at every little feature, every little line of this beautiful creature. And hopefully one day getting close to the point where you could close your eyes and still see it. Adding to that library of information that you want to have as an artist. That experience. So this was definitely the perfect pen for this area. And it proved what I was saying earlier, not going too dark too fast, but allowing yourself that wiggle room where I know how dark it's supposed to be. And see, now I see the thickness of those. I guess that was a 005 or maybe a 001. And the contrast between that is just miles away. So having the patience to choose the right tool. Notice how I did not do the contour. I did it in the darkest areas, but all of here, I want it to be part of the final line, final drawing. Because once you do that contour line, you're basically, it's rigid, and there's no way of you working it out. I mean, it's difficult to work it out of the drawing. Squinting. And at this point, I'm really almost blind drawing. I glance down, I check to make sure my value, especially with these ink pens. Sometimes I could be drawing, I think I'm drawing, but nope, the pen's not leaving a mark. So I want to make sure I am doing that, so I'm not wasting time or motion. But my eyes are fixated. They are 99% on my subject, on my reference. So here we go. I'm going to work the little feature of the eye. From big to smaller to smallest. I'm going to start with, these are almost all stippling marks, like almost dashes and dots all the way throughout, trying to get a nice gradient for that little light that I see in the eye. And even the light is not fully white, so I want to have some dots in there, but really, really well spaced. I think I got it. And now work those concave, convex shadows and the shapes of them in and around. And that is what we're doing. A nice, beautiful portrait. So we want to really pay attention to how we solve those features. It almost became less and less feathery up here. It's just smaller gaps of shadow and light. And overall, there's lots of light. So much, much lighter than what we did earlier. And the direction of those lines with the space between those lines really becomes crucial. We have some of those edges. And then this big shadow coming together. But really pay attention to the curvature. Follow the feather from big to small. And then again, back to patience. So I think that work with the smallest 003. Well done. Takes me back to a 005, which is safe for this darker area. Begin to contour some of these areas of the face. Once again, reaching back to bone and muscle. A lot more tapered, and there's beautiful curvature. Again, I'll repeat that. Reach your finger out and pretend like you can touch it. If you can follow it with your finger, you should be able to draw it with the pen or the pencil. And it is that, the shape, the direction, that is going to give you the proper shape. But you have to see it first. And if you could go beyond seeing it, feeling it, even easier. But we get more and more patient. I realize that more and more as we do more of these projects and exercises, when we're reaching that, coming to the end, I'm almost there, it's almost done. How your focus, your level of focus needs to reach almost its peak. As one of the most important things. How you bring it to an end, how you're finally seeing it. The excitement could be one thing, but really maintaining that control. Almost you want to be aware of your breath. You almost want to be aware of, are you holding your breath? Are you breathing nice and calmly? Are you a little excited? And can you somehow focus all of that as we make these final decisions, which bring all of the work right to the end. And beautifully, all of it coming together. Wow, having the patience to maybe work an entire subject like this with one of these pens would be optimal. And I mean the smallest pen. It may not make sense to some. Well, why? You could just do that with the bigger, but the richness of these lines coming together and just so hair thin, the layering, and how you can really control the buildup, the spacing, the layering, and then the light, of course, the light. And there may be things that you want to do, which would be maybe revisiting larger pens for some of the final touches. But it generally works out the opposite way, from big to small, and finish up with all the small by building it up. So here we're going to put some of these final, they're just, it almost is just hairs. It looks like a little beard almost. And some of these final edges, also enhancing a little more of the darkness. And I want to, just to finish it up, I know I do need a little more layering. And I went back to my 003. But between that and the 005, I'm going to be layering this very, very lightly, very patiently. Because the one thing I want the most is to make sure I get that curvature of the overall form. And that's just done by patiently following the shapes, shadow shapes, light shapes, as you see them. There we are. And darkening, saturating, layering in the direction to enhance that concave convex form. So this is the work, pushing it just a little longer, just a little darker. And I'm also doing a lot of V work here, like V lines, angled lines, which are the edge of the feathers. And just layering them one on top of the other. Also trying to follow that. You see how the light, obviously it's coming from this side. So as we move into the, I guess it would be left side of the bird, it gets darker. So some extra layers with a little bit of gradient that begin to show up, pop up, to give us that sense of roundness of the form through the reading of light. And yep, the choice of maintaining this one final pen here, it really contrasts with the earlier, thicker lines. So it's something I may have done differently. But again, because of time, otherwise this would become a 4 or 5 hour project. Let's go a little bit to this side also as we hit the light here. As it turns away to the other side, it also begins to darken. So you can see how that's working out already with a little bit of layering. And one thing I want to do before I finish the video is work a little bit of the texture of the feet here. So I noticed, yeah, we get lots of dark, but again, looking at shapes, looking at value, looking at direction, how can I create that texture? We have some highlight spots. What I don't want is to think in terms of naming the thing detail-wise. I want to isolate shapes, break down those lines, just like we did all along with the feathers here. And however you can, to create an abstract feel to it. The way you see it is what's important. You see it simplified, where you see those darks, the lights, and emulate the line direction, line saturation to create that final texture. The moment you begin to think feet, you could get carried away, lost into not seeing what you need to actually see here. And it also needs a little more patience. You know, a lot of these shapes really need to be broken down. Got some negative space to deal with. Got a little bit of juxtaposition. This is maybe one area where I could, to create a little break in the contrast of the line, would be to go into scumbling. So I started doing that here, and then gently saturate those areas with a nice combination of parallel hatches and scumbling that generate a little bit of that feel, that texture. And then gently continue pushing this through a little more buildup until we reach the level of satisfaction, which is in the end the most important thing, knowing when you are finished. So I will back away for now, give it a little time, give it a little space. But walk away very happy. And I hope you enjoyed it.